welcome back to Reinforce the Horse. Today we are here with Mr. Scott Beckstead, a lifelong student and admirer of American wild horses. Scott Beckstead is a leading voice for our wild herds in his role as Director of Campaigns for Center for a Humane Economy with an Animal Wellness Action. He grew up with horses on his family's farm and spent much of his childhood and youth on horseback in the mountains of Idaho. After receiving his bachelor's degree from Utah State University and his JD from the University of Utah, Beckstead worked as a litigation attorney in private practice for 17 years on the Central Oregon coast before going to work full-time in the animal protection sector. During his time on the coast, he also served as the mayor of Waldport, Oregon from 2002 to 2007. He became known for his special expertise in the field of animal law and has taught that subject at the University of Oregon and Willamette University law schools. In 2000, he co-authored Animal Law, the first casebook on the subject, and continues to teach animal law, wildlife law and policy, the Endangered Species Act, animal agriculture law, and cannabis law and policy as an adjunct professor at Willamette University. Because of his close familiarity with horses, livestock, and farm animals, Beckstead provides training to law enforcement agencies on how to handle and work with those animals and how to investigate equine and livestock cruelty and neglect. Beckstead lives with his family in Sutherland, Oregon.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Scott, for joining us today. We're definitely excited to pick your brain and help unpack more for the world as it relates to the horses. And I know we'll get into the topic of the wild Mustang roundups. But before we get there, I wonder if you could just kind of fill us in as to where it all began with you and your life and horses.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me as a guest on your podcast, and I'm really excited to be here. And I can tell already that we are kindred spirits in how we feel about these amazing creatures. I was, as Alyssa said, I was raised with horses and also with other animals, and to me, my horses were a source of great comfort. And of course, I had all sorts of really fun adventures on my horses, but even more than that, they were my very, very dear friends. And in fact, I would say that I was probably better friends with my animals, especially my horses, than I was with my human friends. And because I felt this really strong connection with them, I always have felt very protective of them. And I have always felt like it was sort of my mission in life to stand up for all animals and to fight animal abuse and animal exploitation. And so I like to say that I love all of the animals from the whales down to the spiders. I love them all. And I am always that guy that is sticking up for animals and of whatever kind. But my fire burns hottest for the horses. And I think that's just probably owing to the fact that they were such a huge part of my upbringing. And I spent so much time around them. And as I said, they were really a source of friendship and comfort and just adventure. And so I've always felt very strongly about protecting horses from abuse. And I've always felt very moved and very compelled to act whenever I have encountered situations where horses were being mistreated or exploited and so forth. So that sort of is what set me on my path in terms of, how I kind of became a lawyer. That actually, probably the story that I should tell on that is I was watching a news story when I was just a little kid. I was probably no more than, say, 10 years old. And it was a story about how these little baby white seals with the fluffy white coats were being killed in a really terrible way for their fur coats. And I was very, very traumatized and upset by that. And my mother saw my emotional reaction, and she said, you could become a lawyer someday, and you could work on passing laws to protect animals like that, and to make it so that people can't do that kind of thing anymore. And that really got my wheels turning. And because I love to read, and I love to write, and I love to argue, the law really made sense. And it felt like, I remember as a very young child, I thought I might want to be a farmer because that would allow me to work closely with animals. And then I thought I might want to be a veterinarian because that would allow me to work closely with animals. But in the final analysis, my talents really do lend themselves to being an advocate. And that's sort of what I was hardwired to be, as an advocate. And when I was a lawyer, I fought very hard for my clients in court. And basically as a professional animal advocate, I fight very hard for the animals. So, I feel like I'm someone who is doing the work that I was built to do, that I was sort of destined to do. And I'm very fortunate to be able to earn a living doing what I really believe in. And so, I every day I start with gratitude that I'm here, that I'm able to do this work. And I just, I've devoted my whole life to saving and protecting animals.
That's so great. Have you found as a lawyer that it's difficult to be in practice advocating for the animals?
Well, when I was practicing law, I was actually the only lawyer in a small town. So I did all kinds of work. It was mostly civil work that I did, but I did a lot of civil litigation, and I handled a lot of business cases. I did a lot of real estate work and wills and trusts for people and just all kinds of stuff. But because I had a special interest in animals, I got involved in animal law when it was still, just a brand new sort of legal discipline. And so I held myself out as an attorney who believed in protecting animals. And that sort of, I handled a lot of cases that had to do with animals, but it also got me involved in more the academic side, which is how I came to co-author that book on animal law, which was the first casebook of its type. And what spurred me to eventually become a professor, a part-time law professor that teaches these subjects in law school to law students. So, it's, my love of animals, my understanding of animals. I've always been a student of animals. I've studied animals and, biology and wildlife and ecosystems and all that kind of stuff from the time I was a very young child. Combined with my abilities and talents, which really lend themselves to a career in the law, it just sort of blended together perfectly for me.
Fascinating. What point in your practices and studies did you start working with the wild herds?
I started really paying attention to what was happening with our wild horses here in the western United States. Probably when I was practicing law, I started studying it. And let me back up, because I thrilled as a young boy to stories about wild horses. And my favorite stories growing up were stories about wild horses. So I was always very fascinated with them. And I admired them very much. And then when I stopped practicing law in 2008, that's when I really started kind of diving into public policy and the law around our wild horses and how they're being managed by our federal government. And that's what really sort of, woke me up to the fact that, far from being protected, we have a government agency that is actually abusing them. And, it's ironic because it's the same agency that is supposed to be protecting them under federal law. And yet we see that agency engaging in the very same kinds of abusive practices that, led to the law being passed in the first place. So once I became aware of that, I knew that I had to start speaking out for wild horses. And I started really studying, the Bureau of Land Management and how it operates. And I started studying how our public lands, especially in the American West, are being managed. So that really started building my understanding and my expertise on this topic.
As I understand it, the practice of law has a lot to do with language and definitions and such. And there are two particular terms, one of which you've already mentioned, this term wild, versus a term that I've seen pop up maybe from the other side, if you will, saying that the horses out on the range aren't actually wild, they're actually feral. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, I believe that the people that oppose wild horses use the word feral as a way of trying to diminish public support for them. Because when you think about a feral animal, you think of kind of a mangy, ill-kept, ill-tempered animal, that escaped from a state of domestication and is now living, sort of in a semi-wild state. And that is not at all, what our wild horses are about. They are truly wild in the sense that, in the first place, this is where they evolved. Over 54 million years, the horses have lived here in North America, and it's only just been for the past, few thousand years that they've been gone from this landscape. So literally, they have been here on the North American continent except for 0.009% of their history. And because they've been here for many generations, beginning hundreds and hundreds of years ago, I think it's not accurate to say that they are feral. Now, if they had all just recently escaped from a state of domestication and were, ran out onto the range and were surviving out there, then the term feral might be more accurate. But these are animals that are truly wild. They have lived in a wild state apart from domestication for many generations. So I think it's inaccurate to call them feral. But then, of course, the other thing is as a matter of law, the federal law defines wild horses living on our public lands as wild free-roaming horses and burros. And the Supreme Court of the United States, in the case of Kleppe versus New Mexico, specifically referred to wild horses as wildlife. So, even though the enemies of the wild horse would like people to think of them as these sort of, vermin or pests, similar to, I guess, to think of like feral cats or whatever, even though I love feral cats and I do whatever I can to protect them. To call them feral, I think, is really an attempt to try and diminish, their stature and their meaning. And I think, so I actually, I appreciate that question because language is very important, and language is fundamental to the law and understanding the law and enforcing the law. And so, the law refers to these animals as wild. And it's only the people that want them gone to make way for cattle and sheep that are referring to them as feral.
Yeah, I found that really interesting. It's coming into it. And like Alyssa mentioned, prior to our recording here, that, horses entered our lives not long ago. So we really had no knowledge of horses really but a mere 5 years ago. And as I've just been gathering more information and learning more about the wild horses, and that term feral popped up, it was like a red flag to me of, wait a minute, that's a different word. So thank you for expanding on that. And, you mentioned another term, abuse. So the the abuse of a government agency or the government agency abusing the horses. And Alyssa and I have seen, a lot of footage now. As you know, abuse is a strong word, but I can't think of anything better if we were just to sit down people who are not horse people and just have them watch videos. I like to think that there are good people in every organization. It just seems to me that there's a huge disconnect. The boots on ground, so to speak, are communicating a completely different message than what the law actually affords and requires.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that the word abuse is a strong word, and I don't use it lightly. But, I take, for example, the way that the Bureau of Land Management has conducted this roundup in eastern Nevada called the Antelope Complex, where they targeted over 3,100 horses for capture and removal. And Laura Lee, who has been observing and documenting wild horse roundups for decades and probably has more experience and knowledge than anyone that I know, she has called this one of the worst roundups she's ever seen. And at least 31 horses, at least, that we know of, have lost their lives. The horrifying video of that Palomino stallion who tried escaping out of the trap and snapped his back leg and was still chased for 35 minutes by the helicopter and by a guy on horseback before he was finally put out of his misery, and chasing newborn foals for miles with a helicopter through triple-digit heat. Those kind of things, the reason why I call that animal abuse is because, number one, if any of the rest of us did that to our own animals, I know that here in Oregon, you'd probably be arrested and put in jail. The Bureau of Land Management could easily have changed its schedule to give the foals time to grow and develop and for temperatures to cool down. There are so many things that the BLM could have done. But they proceeded despite all of these factors, despite the fact that there were brand new foals, heavily pregnant mares, and the fact that it was just, so hot, out in the middle of that desert. The fact that it completely disregarded all of those considerations and proceeded in a manner that led to the deaths of at least 31 horses. And of course, that doesn't count all of the little baby foals that, got left behind and that, I'm sure by now have perished, without their mothers out there in the desert. That's animal abuse. And I don't know what else to call it. The BLM, just kind of shrugs it off and says, oh, these kinds of things happen, whenever you're working with wild animals. And so that's the mentality of the people that are in charge of our wild horses. And when you talk to the vast majority of Americans and they become aware of this, they're horrified. And they're horrified not just that it's happening, but that it's happening at our expense, that our tax dollars are paying for it. And so that really is one of our most important missions here is raising awareness. And that's why I'm so grateful for this, for this podcast and this opportunity to speak. We have to raise awareness and we have to get the message out there to the American people that our federal government is engaging in taxpayer-funded animal abuse, and they're doing it to benefit private industry. And when people finally understand that, they're horrified. And it doesn't matter what their political affiliation is, what party they belong to, they are horrified. And it's generally only people who stand to benefit from these practices that actually support it.
Okay, so you mentioned the helicopters. The helicopters for me are a really, really difficult topic. I'm a rusty private pilot, fixed wing, so I've never flown helicopters. but I guess I could say I have the pilot title. So I've been around aircraft, and I've also, served in the military in the Air Force, and I've been around aircraft and been around a good amount of helicopters. And I think it was when I was watching Wild Beauty and the maneuvers that these helicopter pilots were undertaking, the first word that popped up in my mind was militaristic. And I think I even shouted out, like, they're running like military operations against these forces. I'm wondering if I'm way off base there, or if you might have some insight in regards to that. And I know there's some other aspects as far as them more or less cloaking the flight paths and the details of the altitude.
Especially with like how low that they're flying, because I don't have any knowledge on, the militaristic maneuvers Dad is speaking of, but I mean, I'm a human and I can hear planes and helicopters fly overhead. To see them so close to these horses, which as far as I'm concerned, they have much better hearing than I do, it seems a little, it seems, I can't even put a word on it, and I don't understand what the need to be so close to them. I don't remember which film we were watching, but it was so close. I mean, it seemed like the helicopters in feet of this horse.
Single digits.
Yeah.
No, I agree. And these helicopter pilots, let me start by saying, are getting paid a lot of money. The helicopter contractor that the BLM uses the most, and that the BLM has been using for the Antelope Complex Roundup in eastern Nevada, is Couture Livestock Roundups, Inc. That is the Couture family that lives in Nephi, Utah, and they are the BLM's favorite helicopter contractor. The founder of that company is Dave Couture, who pleaded guilty to and was convicted in 1992 of illegally using his aircraft to hunt wild horses and send them to slaughter. And yet that is who our federal government prefers to use for these roundups. And I want to make sure that your listeners are aware that there is a bill in Congress that would ban the use of aircraft to manage wild horse and burro populations. And that is the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act. And the bill number is H.R. 3656. And the sponsor is Representative Dina Titus from Nevada. But that bill would ban the use of aircraft to manage wild horse and burro populations, and it would also require the Bureau of Land Management to explore more humane options. So I want to make sure that people know that if they want to take action to stop the helicopter roundups, call your members of Congress, and that number is 202-224-3121. And that number again, this is the Congressional Switchboard, 202-224-3121, and ask for your United States representative and both of your United States senators, and tell them to please co-sponsor the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act, H.R. 3656, to ban the use of aircraft to manage wild horses and burros. So that's an important thing to do. But yes, and there's no doubt when you consider, what that experience must be like for those horses to be chased by a helicopter of all things. The animals are clearly terrified. And that's why, they come stampeding into the traps, and they break their necks and they break their legs, and foals get left behind and orphaned. And there's just, it's just awful. And it seems like, what the Bureau of Land Management does do really well is try and cover itself. And whenever there's a terrible story like what happened with that stallion that broke his leg, or, last year when a little foal broke its front leg and the helicopter continued to chase it, and then took a half hour before that poor little thing was euthanized. the Bureau of Land Management likes to trot out the fact that it has a set of rules called the Comprehensive Animal Welfare Program. And it always says, oh, don't worry, we have these rules here, that we wrote to make sure that these roundups are humane. The problem is that they violate their own rules all day, every day. The rules are just for window dressing. They are not legally enforceable. And so the BLM, has a very sophisticated public relations campaign to try and keep, the American public disinformed. Giving false information to the American people about what is happening, and creating this false narrative that there's too many wild horses, and if we don't round them up, they're going to starve to death, or there's going to be harm to the rangeland. And what the Bureau of Land Management does not ever say is how many livestock are out there. And it's very frustrating when we see journalists and reporters just sort of repeating that false narrative by the BLM without asking any real questions. And so the Bureau of Land Management says, we have to do a roundup of this herd, XYZ herd. There's 500 horses on this herd management area, and that is just too many horses for that range to sustain. And no one is asking the question, okay, you said that there's 500 horses. How many cattle and sheep? And that's the one question that the Bureau of Land Management fears the most. Because if they're honest, what they will say is that cattle and sheep outnumber wild horses on designated wild horse habitat by sometimes up to 100 to 1. So wild horses are being scapegoated for overgrazing that is actually caused by cattle and sheep. But the ranchers don't want those horses there because they want all that grass for themselves, for their cattle and sheep. And so, and the BLM, beholding to the livestock industry, repeats that narrative over and over again to give the American public the sense that, oh my gosh, we've got to do this because there's too many horses and they're in danger of starving.
Yeah, I've heard that one a number of times. I think with Willow and Grace's herd, it was first a drought or something, and then the public figured out it wasn't a drought, and then the BLM threw out something else.
Yeah, they just changed
the narrative. But then there's also this thing where I've heard, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but only a small fraction of wild horses that are rounded up are actually rehomed. I'm not exactly sure where the other big part of the fraction that's not rehomed goes, but I don't know. I'm curious. Do you know anything about where they put the horses that aren't rehomed?
Yeah. So the first place horses are taken after they are rounded up is to what is called short-term holding, and these are big, filthy, dirty corrals where large numbers of horses are kept in very unhealthy conditions, very stressful conditions. There they are sorted, the stallions are castrated, and they're given vaccines, they're given a neck brand, and then the animals are put up for adoption. And the BLM has a program called the Adoption Incentive Program, where they will pay you $1,000 per horse to adopt up to 4 horses. And unfortunately, that program is being taken advantage of by unscrupulous people who will, join together with other members of their family to go and adopt 4 horses apiece. So they'll leave with a trailer of 20 horses, or more, and they throw all those horses out into a corral or a pasture for a year, and don't work with them, don't socialize them, just basically feed them barely enough to keep them alive. And then after that year expires and they get their certificate of title from the Bureau of Land Management, they take them directly to the auction to be sold for slaughter. So yes, some wild horses go to good, responsible homes. But, we are seeing unprecedented numbers of wild horses and burros in the slaughter pipeline because of the BLM's adoption incentive program. And even when presented with proof, the BLM denies that it's a problem. And part of the reason why they lie about it is because they are knowingly adopting horses over and over again to people that they know are gaming the system like this. So you've got short-term holding. Some animals are going to be adopted. Some of those are adopted to good homes. Some are adopted to terrible people who send them to slaughter. But then the animals that are not adopted are sent to what's called long-term holding. And these are private ranches, mostly in the Midwest, in states like Oklahoma and Nebraska and Kansas. And the federal government pays these ranchers to hold on to these horses for the rest of their lives. So, and it's just a backward world. So we're taking wild horses that thrive out, in the desert and mountainous West, where they thrive and belong, and we're putting them in lush Midwestern pastures that should be feeding cattle. That should be, that's where cattle belong. And instead, we're removing these horses, putting them on cattle pasture to make room for cattle to be out in the middle of the desert where cattle clearly don't belong. So it's a complete financial boondoggle. The helicopter contractors are making tens of millions of dollars. The off-range holding contractors, those private ranchers that are getting paid to hold on to horses, are being paid millions and millions of dollars.
What happens to the horses when they're in long-term holding? Like, are they ultimately shipped to slaughter, or do they just die in like a kill pen sort of setting?
No, they live out their lives there. They're separated by sex. So there's no mingling of males and females. Of course, all of the males are castrated as soon as they arrive off the range, so that they are no longer stallions; they're geldings. But the geldings and the mares are all kept separate, and they are all turned out into these private pastures. Now, there are also long-term holding facilities, like one that's owned by J.R. Simplot, which is a food company in Idaho. And their long-term holding looks just like their beef feedlot. They in addition to being a food processor, they also run cattle on BLM grazing allotments across 5 western states. So they've got a huge beef operation, J.R. Simplot does. And they hold on to and get paid by the U.S. government to hold on to thousands of wild horses at their location in Bruno, Idaho. And it looks just like their beef feedlot. It's just a dirt lot, and the horses are fed like cattle. And that's...
Do they use the horses for meat as well?
They say they don't. No, I mean, they would be prohibited from doing that. They would be prohibited from doing that.
So there's a lot to unpack here, Scott. I guess let me back up a little bit and kind of expand this and take it outside of the realm of horses. You've already mentioned that horses are scapegoats in this situation, which I agree with. But I'll bring up two scenarios that I have personal experience with that are outside of the realm of horses, but it smells similar. One is the burn pit fiasco that happened in the war theater of Iraq and Afghanistan back in the early mid-2000s. The PACT Act had been enforced, and they're bringing in a lot of presumptive illnesses as a result of that exposure. And I remember back serving in the theater in 2008. I was a lowly staff sergeant in the Air Force, JAG paralegal, thinking, this environmental stuff that is going on in this war theater is wrong. And I remember kind of blowing that whistle until the powers that may be said, with no uncertainty, Sergeant Raymond, shut the hell up and just do your job that you're here to do. That was circa 2008. And I think it wasn't until 2010, 2011 that they actually decided to shut down the burn pits. And where I'm getting at with that is the way I understand it, it was run by government contractors who were effectively getting paid copious amounts of money of taxpayer dollars under defense spending, but they were kind of turning a blind eye as to like actually running the business, if you will, the way they were supposed to. It seems really similar. And it wasn't until, I don't know if it was congressional inquiry or what have you, inspector general or whatnot, in the military realm, that it ultimately came in and investigated that and brought that out about and ultimately shut it down. Another similarity, a completely separate topic, is here locally in southeast Arizona. We have a groundwater crisis. That's, a natural resource, which I liken to the wild horses in that, it's available for all. It's public to some degree. And we have multi-billion-dollar corporations that plant their dairies and their other operations in our area because we have very little regulation on how groundwater is pulled from the environment. Even just 20 minutes down the road, we have a huge dairy that is pulling thousands upon thousands of gallons of water per day and causing a colossal amount of environmental issues for the short and long term. And where I'm getting at with all that, it just seems like these sorts of issues run parallel within our government.
Yeah.
And the issue to me, and you've alluded to, isn't the horses, isn't the wild burros, isn't the other species that are out on the open range. It seems to me the true issue is the money trail. But I haven't seen a lot in my own personal research on a lot pointing in that direction. Like
the evidence.
Yeah, asking Congress for inquiries into that realm specifically. Like, let's do a forensic accounting analysis or something of that sort and figure out where this money's going and what's actually happening. Because it sounds like, there's double or triple dipping, for lack of better terms, going on. And
yeah. Everything you're saying really resonates, and I teach animal agriculture law, and I talk about the environmental consequences of large-scale industrial animal agriculture. But I also touch on the issue of how we allocate our water and our land, mostly to raise food for animals that we intend to slaughter for meat. And we have enough land to feed the world many times over if we weren't using our land to raise food for animals that we're going to slaughter for their meat. Talking about Arizona and its aquifers, Saudi Arabia drained its aquifers to raise alfalfa for its dairy cows. And after it had drained its aquifers, it came to Arizona and started buying up land and water rights. And now a huge portion of the water that is being pulled out of Arizona's aquifers, which, by the way, take thousands of years to recharge and refill, is being used to raise alfalfa for Saudi Arabian dairies. And the idea, for example, that China can come in and start buying up, which it is doing, huge pieces of American farmland should really concern everybody. And I agree with you. The horse issue is just, it's just one piece of the puzzle. It's just it's just one more sort of indication that we've got a political system that is completely out of whack and that is geared not toward attending to the needs and wishes of the American people, but in enriching a very entitled and very powerful few, many of which are not even United States interests or people. So, for example, at less than 2% of the U.S. beef supply is being raised on Western public lands, and yet we are giving those livestock companies a huge competitive advantage by allowing them to graze their cattle and sheep at $1.35 per animal unit month. And, who's ultimately responsible for that? Well, I mean, you could say, Congress is the one that's giving the Bureau of Land Management the go-ahead, but who's telling Congress what to do? Well, groups like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, which does not represent, despite its name, does not represent the interests of American farmers and ranchers. It represents the global meat cartels. JBS, the largest meat company in the world, headquartered in Brazil and run by a family so corrupt that they are constantly in and out of prison for misconduct and for corruption. Or Smithfield, the largest pork company in the world that owns massive factory farms growing pigs, and it's a Chinese company, and what they have figured out is it's cheaper and more economical to raise their pigs here in the United States, to produce their pork here in the United States, so that it's the American people that have to deal with the air pollution and the water pollution and all of the other terrible externalized costs that factory farms create, so that they can have cheap pork back in China. And, so the idea that these are, very powerful corporations, including multinational corporations, that are benefiting from the eradication of wild horses from our public lands and the eradication of wolves and and trying to get the grizzly bear delisted so that it can be hunted and removed as a threat to cattle and sheep, or the slaughter of thousands of bison, native bison, every year to benefit Montana beef companies. You really hit it on the head. It's about the money. It's not about what's in the best interest of the American people. It's about what's in the best interest of the people that are benefiting economically from this system.
Thank you so much for clarifying that and taking time to go down that segue, because that's just been something as I've researched on my own and coming up with, and it's just nice to have your perspective on that. And I did want to clarify for our listeners, you mentioned the animal unit month, and I think you said $1.25 per animal unit month.
$1.35, yeah. So $1.35 an animal unit month is defined as the forage it takes to feed one horse, or a cow-calf pair, or 5 sheep. Okay, so for a rancher to graze a cow-calf pair on public lands, they pay $1.35. A cattle producer in a non-BLM state like Texas or Kansas or Oklahoma or Florida is paying over $20 per animal unit month. That's the market rate. If all Congress did was require ranchers to pay the actual market rate to graze on our public lands, every single rancher that grazes on public lands would go broke. They couldn't afford it. So basically, we taxpayers are subsidizing a lifestyle choice of these Western ranchers who have made the decision on their own to raise their livestock in a hostile, inhospitable environment where livestock do not belong. And we taxpayers are the ones that are funding that choice that they've made. It's our wild horses and our wildlife and our natural environment that are paying the price.
Right. In addition to the long-term holding, land leases, in addition to the helicopter roundup contract, and all that goes into it, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it just smells like fraud, waste, and abuse.
And here's how you know there's a problem. When you ask the Bureau of Land Management, when you send them a public records request, which is also known as a Freedom of Information Act request, they will stonewall you. They will delay. They will do everything they can to keep you from getting the information that you ask for, and the information you ask for is likely to be heavily redacted. So there's no transparency. The agency is desperate for the public not to know how it's doing its business.
And I want to piggyback on that, just based on my own personal experience in the JAG office of the United States Air Force. I've personally handled a number of FOIA requests, and was part of the team that was involved in redacting and going through and scrupulous detail about how those requests were received and how they were ultimately transmitted. And so I want our listeners to understand that every government agency has data, and that data is available to the public under the Freedom of Information Act. But like Scott just mentioned, you don't always get everything that you request, and there's definitely a process that goes on behind the scenes. And for lack of better terms to express it, a lot of times there's scrubbing of the documents and a very fine line of what's legal and not that can occur to ultimately release or not release as much or as little of information as that agency wants.
Yeah. We have to keep in mind that, the government is run by human beings, and human beings like to avoid, if possible, admitting to, their own misdeeds or misconduct or failure to act or whatever, poor performance. And so, even though there is a law that is supposed to guarantee citizens the right to, get records on how their government is functioning, the human beings inside the government don't always want people to know that. And that's what we see with the Bureau of Land Management. We see an effort to really stonewall and to keep the public from finding out what's going on. And and that even happens in the roundups themselves, the wild horse roundups. They position the observers so far away from the traps and so forth that there's really no opportunity for meaningful observation of what's going on with the roundups. Or they will put public observers behind ridges and hills and, rocky cliffs and stuff so that their view of the roundup is obscured. They don't want people to see. And they will find all sorts of excuses for that. Well, we want the public observers to be safe, and we want the horses to be safe. And it's all nonsense. What it really is they don't want people to have a good view of what those horses are going through.
Yeah. It's sad.
And then there was the whole thing on them and carrying firearms, and the BLM officer claimed that he carries a firearm to contain the people, the observers that are watching. Whereas,
to control the people.
Thank you, to control the people, then they just let them run for miles and miles. Meanwhile, I'm pretty sure they're all carrying a firearm that's perfectly capable of putting this animal out of its misery in minutes.
Yeah,
that's a really good point.
That is a really good point, and yes, to this whole idea that they have to be armed to deal with advocates that are just there to watch. Again, I think that is a deliberate attempt to cast wild horse advocates, members of the public who care about these animals, as somehow the bad guys. Like, we're the bad guys because we care and we want to come and watch the wild horses. And they it's all theatrics. They wear sidearms, because that is a very theatrical way of saying that, the real threat are these horse lovers who are here to watch the roundup. And it's just nonsense. And it's all just like, it's very performative. And we all know that the real threat are those helicopters, that's the threat.
Mm-hmm.
Scott, could you quickly just give us like a 30-second recap of the history of the roundups? Because I know some people have mentioned to me, well, it's been going on for decades.
It has been going on for decades. And before the 1971 law was passed, it was happening because it was, horses living on public lands had no protections whatsoever. And so they were rounded up by people that would just sell them for pet food. So, the American public was outraged with that. So that led to the passage of the law. But the ranching community immediately started to object to the fact that these animals were protected, and the Bureau of Land Management, rather than standing up to the livestock interests and protecting the horses, they started doing exactly what the ranching interests wanted, which is using helicopters to chase these animals and reduce their numbers.
Very cool. You've given us so much to think about and talk about more. To switch gears a bit, as we close up here, do you have a particular horse that comes to mind that you just, in your life, that you were just uber excited about?
I do. I have known amazing horses over my lifetime, but I think many of us horse people have that what we call the once in a lifetime horse. And for me, that was a great big thoroughbred gelding named Cheyenne. And Cheyenne came to me in 1997. He was an off-track thoroughbred who had been badly abused. When I met him and adopted him, he was unrideable, unapproachable. He was psychologically broken. And frankly, he was terrifying because, again, he was big, tall, and looked at me like, he was going to eat me for lunch the first time he saw me. I worked every single day to gain his trust, and he rewarded me by becoming the greatest horse that I've ever known in my life. And he carried me. We had so many amazing adventures together. This is when I lived in Waldport on the coast, and so my favorite adventures were when I would take him to the beach. And, he was a thoroughbred, so the one thing he loved to do more than anything was run. And I remember I would get him to the beach, where I had literally miles and miles and miles of that hard packed sand, and I would just lean over, stand up in the stirrups, and loosen the reins, and he would just shoot like a rocket. And just the first mile was just a headlong sprint, with his mane whipping me in the face and the tears streaming out of my eyes. And he would eventually settle into this long, steady, 3-beat gallop that he could literally go for miles and miles and miles on that beach and not even break a sweat, and when I finally would pull him up to turn around and go the other way, he wasn't even winded. He was just doing what he was built to do. And those are peak experiences. Those are experiences that give, the texture of my life story. Really, some really wonderful, wonderful things to remember and to take with me. He passed away on New Year's Eve in 2018 at the age of 29. But he was my big buddy. And he was when he was in his prime, he carried himself like a retired athlete. There was sort of this aloofness. He was sort of aloof, he really didn't like lots of affection, and I'm a pretty affectionate guy when it comes to animals. And he would, he tolerated me and all that, but But as he got older, I think he seemed to sort of soften, and he sort of started to appreciate that affection. And in his later years, he just was a big teddy bear. You know, if I had to list my 5 very, very best friends of my life, of course, my wife would be number 1. But I would say he was probably a close second or third. He was that important to me, and our connection was that meaningful to me. And the memories that I have of our times together are that important to me. So yeah. And you know, it's funny because if you're not a horse person, you don't get it. You're like, I mean, it's a horse. A horse is a horse. What's the big deal? But if you are a horse person, you know exactly what I'm talking about, you know.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you so much for sharing that. We definitely like to highlight the horses in people's lives on the show.
Yeah.
And they've been just so instrumental to my life, and just, you know, in my late 30s, early 40s, just I wondered where they have been the previous decades.
Where they've been all your life.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, I just want to make sure, because you are, you have a military background, there is also a bill called the Veterans for Mustangs Act, and this is a bill that has a lot of bipartisan support. It's especially popular with Republicans who care about veterans and veteran issues. And this bill would require the Bureau of Land Management to hire retired members of the military to go out and help manage wild horse populations with fertility control. So if that's something that you that you believe in, and you think that is a win-win for veterans and Mustangs, then call your members of Congress and let them know.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for mentioning that, Scott, because we recently, Cameron Green, Veterans for Mustangs organization founder, as a guest, and so he shared a bit about that.
Cameron's a great friend of mine, and he and I have met with a lot of members of Congress on that issue. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, and I'm definitely, I've been in talks with him, and, if there's anything that I can do from your end, please keep me in mind, because I'm, just looking at ways I can help the best I can.
Yeah, likewise.
So.
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you for that.
How do you like to reinforce your horse?
I think a horse owner's number one duty and job is to make their horse feel safe. Horses are a prey animal, which means that, they have a heightened sense of fear, because the fear is what keeps them alive. And a happy horse is a horse that feels safe. And so, I always want my horses to know that they are safe, and that they are loved, and that they can be confident around me, that they don't have to worry about being punished. They don't have to worry about being hurt. That's how I believe we should be reinforcing the horse.
That makes my heart so happy to hear that. Yeah, thank you for that.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation. I can't thank you enough. Is there any last words of wisdom that you'd like to share, or how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, I mean, you can follow my work on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. I do a weekly Wednesday series called Wild Horse Wednesday that I post, where I just give updates on what's happening with the wild horses. And then I've started doing a new series called Safe Act Saturday, where I talk about the SAFE Act, which is the Save America's Forgotten Equines. So definitely follow me on social media. And then you can also go to animalwellness.org. That's animalwellnessaction.org, animalwellnessaction.org, and follow the work of our organization, because we work on a lot more than just horse issues. We cover everything from kangaroos in Australia to right whales to orcas to wildlife, just all sorts of things. So I would encourage people to follow me and follow the work that we're doing, and always never stop calling your members of Congress, because that's where change happens.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much. I know I've sent a number of letters. Do you recommend calling as opposed to writing letters, or are they synonymous?
The very best thing you can do is call and schedule a meeting with your member of Congress or their staff. That's a face-to-face meeting, either by Zoom or if you're ever in Washington D.C. I think that is number one. But
is that possible to do as an individual?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Okay. You can call and you can request a meeting, and it'll probably be with a member of their staff. But getting on a first name basis with those staff members that work on animal welfare and public lands and so forth is probably the most impactful thing that you can do. You can call the BLM, but they don't care. You can call Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland. She doesn't care. You can call the BLM Director Tracy Stone Manning. She doesn't care. But your member of Congress knows that you're a voter and knows that you're a taxpayer. And so they will listen. Doesn't mean that they'll necessarily agree with you, but if you have consistent contact with them so that you're on a first name basis with whoever that staffer is that works on these issues, that will have an impact for sure.
Very cool. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Helps me.
You bet.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time, and
thank
you to
incredible.
Everybody listening.
Yeah, it's been incredible having this conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, and thank you for having me as a guest, and happy to talk with you guys anytime.